HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rise of Athens, the story of the world's greatest civilization, by Anthony Everitt, read by Michael Page. Preface. As a small child, I devoured a Victorian storybook that told tales of Greek and Roman mythology. I read every word, except for the sickly sweet poems that were scattered across its pages. My paternal grandmother noticed my interest in the ancient world and bought me 3 Penguin classics, then a new publishing enterprise. She chose Everitt's versions of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and a translation of Plato's Symposium. A farmer's wife, she was no classicist, and the last of these books came a little early for a prepubertal child who was mystified by the references to Hellenic homosexuality. But I could not have been given a better sense, smell, flavour of Greek civilization. Homer and Plato introduced me to a world that was new and ravishing, which, for all the tragedy and the bloodshed, radiated the sunlight and luminous skies of free thought. For a span of 200 years in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the ancient Athenians pioneered astonishing advances in almost every field of human endeavour. They invented the only real or complete democracy, the word itself is Greek, that has ever existed outside the classical age. Whereas we merely elect representatives to act on our behalf, citizens then met in assembly and took every important decision themselves. I need to enter a reservation here. The franchise was limited to adult males and so excluded 2 large social groups, women and slaves. The Athenians believed in reason and its power to solve the mysteries of the human condition and of nature. They established the concepts and language of philosophy and raised issues with which today's thinkers still wrestle. They pioneered the arts of tragedy and comedy, architecture and sculpture. They invented history as the accurate narration and interpretation of past events. With their fellow Greeks, they developed mathematics and the natural sciences. We must beware of exaggeration. The Athenians were part of a general Hellenic advance and borrowed ideas and technologies from their non-Greek neighbours, for example the Egyptians and the Persians, in spite of their vaunted scorn for barbarians. If only we knew as much about other societies in and around the Eastern Mediterranean in classical times as we do about them, they might not look to be quite so exceptional. We would probably have to make a lesser claim. Nevertheless, even if the Athenians were not unique, that takes nothing away from the fact of what they did achieve. The greatness of Socrates will not be compromised by the discovery of a mute, inglorious counterpart. Although Athenians were indeed rationalists, they were also deeply religious. Worship of the Olympian gods was integrated into every corner of daily life. Most of them believed these anthropomorphic divinities to be players in the great game of history quite as much as human beings. We in the West complacently note that a fully independent Athenian democracy lasted only 200 years or so. It is well to remember that our own democracies, in their complete form, have yet to last that long. The mechanics of the Athenian democratic system are relevant to today's electronic world. The arrival of the computer means that, should we so wish, we could move back from representative to direct democracy. As in the heyday of classical Athens, the people would genuinely be able to take all important decisions. Each citizen would, in effect, be a member of the government. Are we brave enough to take such a rational step? For all the wonders of ancient Athens, or rather because of them, I faced a fundamental question. How was it that this tiny community of 200,000 souls or so, in other words, no more populous than, say, York in England or Little Rock in Arkansas, managed to give birth to towering geniuses across the range of human endeavour and to create one of the greatest civilizations in history? Indeed, it laid the foundations of our own contemporary intellectual universe. In my account of the city's rise and fall, I seek to answer this question, or at least to point towards an answer. If we were able to travel back more than 2 millennia and walk the streets and alleys of ancient Athens, we might very well come across the master playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the sculptor Pheidias, the comedian Aristophanes, the bad boy of Athenian politics Alcibiades. Perhaps we overhear a class in ethics that Socrates is giving in a shoe shop on the edge of the agora, and meet two of his students, Plato and Xenophon. At a citizens' assembly, we listen to a speech by that greatest of statesmen, Pericles. This is the Athens I evoke, beginning with its early centuries of kings, tyrants, and aristocrats, moving on to the invention of democracy and the city's political and cultural heyday, and concluding with its decline into a pleasant university town. The story is much less well known than that of Rome, but it had just as great an influence on posterity, on today's Western civilization, in a word, on us. The Athenians laid the foundations of the house in which we live today. We ought to remember and celebrate what they built. And what a story it is, crammed with adventure and astounding reversals of fortune. On the game board of Eastern Mediterranean politics from the 6th to the 4th century BC, there were three main players. The first of these was Athens. It was a maritime rather than a land power, and encouraged trade throughout the known world. Its fleets came to dominate the Aegean Sea. Its citizens bought and sold goods and services, were devoted to culture and the arts, and were inquisitive and open-minded. Sparta was different in every way, one of the strangest societies in the history of the world. A city-state in the Peloponnese, the peninsula that makes up southern Greece, it was highly disciplined and dedicated to warfare. It was widely recognized as the leading Greek power. Male citizens lived collectively and spent much of their lives in communal messes. Called Spartiates, or, to deny them their individuality, equals, they were forbidden to farm or trade, and were brought up to be professional soldiers. They conquered much of the Peloponnese and enslaved its population as serfs, or helots. These helots served their masters by working their estates for them. They were regularly humiliated and could be put to death at will. Young Spartiates were trained brutally to be brutal. The aim was to turn them into pitiless fighters, to abjure personal wealth, and to be silent, modest, and polite. Theirs was a self-sufficient community, closed, dour, and totalitarian, with little interest in the outside world. The third player was the vast Persian Empire on the far side of the Aegean Sea. In the mid-6th century, an Iranian nobleman, Cyrus the Great, conquered and annexed all the great kingdoms of the Middle East. Ultimately, Cyrus's domains stretched from the Balkans to the Indus, from Central Asia to Egypt. He was an absolute monarch. The prosperous Greek cities along the littoral of Asia Minor fell under his sway. This was a standing insult to the entire Greek world, which saw foreigners as barbarians, that is, barbaroi, or people who make noises sounding like bar instead of speaking proper Greek. Here the tectonic rock layers of two cultures met and ground against each other. Conflict was inevitable. As in a complicated ballet, these dancers would entwine their bodies, exchanging friends and enemies, moving in turn from war to peace and to war again. The three great powers enjoyed golden zeniths, but all three ended up facing defeat and disaster. Their progress conveys all the thrills of a historical roller coaster ride. I write narrative history. I never reveal future outcomes or endings during the telling, for I want listeners to have no better idea of what is to happen next than those who lived through the events I describe. If they are unfamiliar with ancient history, they are in for a lively time. Some of the stories in the ancient sources have a suspiciously fictional ring, or so picky scholars claim. Solon's encounter with King Croesus of Lydia is a good example. We cannot always say at this distance of time whether they are true or false, but, like the myths and legends, they are good stories, and even if some of them have been embellished, they cast a bright light on how Greeks saw themselves, so I happily retell them. I do my best to sketch the Athenian record in the fields of philosophy and the arts, but a sketch is all I have space for. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides are represented by masterpieces, including the Oresteia, Antigone, and the Trojan Women, and the ideas of Plato and Aristotle are only adumbrated. Lysistrata speaks up for Aristophanes, but I hope to have done enough to illustrate their greatness. Ancient historians are very variable in quality, with part of the 5th century being much more fully covered than the 4th. The work of many writers has been wholly or partly lost, thanks to the corrosive passage of time. Thucydides is the greatest writer of history in history. In fact, he is so good that we are trapped inside his version of events. Lesser authors give themselves away, offer some purchase for the modern scholar, and allow corrections and new interpretations. What Thucydides does not write about is an empty space that usually we cannot fill, and what he does write about is usually irrefutable. There are topics that even the finest chroniclers, such as Thucydides, do not touch except tangentially. For example, economics and social life. Also, we know far more about Athens than any other of the many city-states and their Mediterranean colonies that made up ancient Greece. One way or another, we have less to say than we would like about wider developments. There are many matters on which today's experts disagree. In general, I touch on their debates only in the endnotes and leave the main narrative clean of scholarly controversy. How should I spell the names of people and places? In Western Europe, we were first introduced to the literature and history of ancient Greece via the Romans and their language, Latin. The convention was established of using Latinate spelling for Hellenic proper nouns. It was only in the Renaissance that most Europeans came into direct contact with Greek as a language, and by then the practice was too ingrained to change. So most of us speak of Achilles and not Achilleus, Alcibiades and not Alcibiades, Plato and not Platon. I have decided to keep to these Roman forms because of their familiarity. Listeners would be puzzled and daunted by a strictly accurate transliteration from the Greek to the European alphabet. A few esoteric technical terms are exempted from this rule. Also, some very famous names have anglicized versions that most people use and I prefer. For example, Athens to Athenae, Greek, or Athenae, Latin. Corinth, English, to Corinthos, Greek, or Corinthus, Latin, and Sparta, Latin, to Spartae, Greek. I borrow the Greco-Latin versions of foreign and mostly Persian names, so I refer to Astyages, the Median king, rather than Ishtumegu. Lesser-known places in the Greek world take their original form. In some, every rule has an exception, and I have followed my taste. In proper names ending with E, the E is pronounced in the English way as E. In Greek, it would be A, as in hay, and in those ending with ES as ease. It is hard to be precise about the value of money, because the relative worth of different products varies from time to time and from economy to economy. The principal units of the Athenian currency were 6 obols equals 1 drachma, 100 drachmas equals 1 mina, 60 minas equals 1 talent. 1 drachma was a day's pay for a foot soldier or a skilled worker in the 5th and 4th centuries. From 425 BC, a juror received from the state a daily allowance of half a drachma or 3 obols, just enough to maintain a family of 3 at a basic level of subsistence. So the payment was adequate rather than extravagant. A talent was a unit of weight and equaled 26 kilograms. It also signified the monetary value of 26 kilograms of silver. The 200 rowers who crewed a trireme during the Peloponnesian War were paid a talent for 1 month's worth of work. An obol was a small silver coin. It was placed in a dead man's mouth so that he had the wherewithal to pay the ferryman Charon for passage across the river Acheron to the underworld. I omit the term BC or AD with dates, except in the rare cases where there might otherwise be a misunderstanding. In many respects, we can recognize the people of Athens. This is no great surprise, for they pioneered so many of the fields of knowledge that are current and alive today. But in so many ways they inhabited a different moral and technological universe. Their motto was, "Know yourself." They simply would not have understood the Christian command to love your neighbor as yourself. If I have helped to bridge the gap between ourselves and our Hellenic forebears and conveyed a little of my enthusiasm for the founders of our civilization, I shall be well pleased. Introduction. The young king from foreign and uncivilized Macedon forced the great city of Athens into submission and enslaved the whole of Hellas, together with its quarrelsome horde of city-states. This was not because he seriously disliked the Greeks. Far from it. He was deeply impressed by their military and cultural achievements. In fact, he longed to be accepted as a full and complete member of the Hellenic club. He was Alexander the Great, son of Philip, and it was the year 334. But what was the nature of Greekness, and how did one get hold of it? The simplest way of answering the question was to study and digest the epic poem The Iliad. Set in a remote past, it concerned the 10-year siege of Troy, a city in Phrygia, by a Greek army. Every Athenian, indeed every Greek boy, learned of heroes such as Achilles and Agamemnon, Hector and Odysseus, who fought in the war and did his best to emulate them. Their deeds embodied Greekness. Alexander cast himself as the new Achilles, as the bravest Hellene of them all. He first encountered the Iliad as a child, and it guided his life. He took a copy with him on his travels, and when a finely made casket was presented to him that had previously belonged to the Persian great king, he asked his friends what precious object he should keep inside it. All kinds of suggestions were made, but Alexander said firmly that he would deposit his Iliad there for safe-keeping and for splendor. Hellenes at home will have laughed at the royal upstart's pretensions, but they were just as deeply indebted as Alexander was to the world that Homer conjured to life. It was here that they found their moral, personal, social, and political attitudes. In fact, it was a lost world, even when the Iliad was composed sometime towards the end of the 8th century. The poem was a long written text, but inspired by compositions learned by heart and spoken or sung at important social occasions. Homer may or may not have existed. We simply don't know. He could have been one man, a collective, or even a woman. But anyone reading the poem will feel that he has been in the presence of a controlling mind, whatever its name and nature. Its companion piece, the Odyssey, which describes the adventures of Odysseus, king of a small island off western Greece, and his 10-year journey home from Troy, may have been another author's work. Did the Trojan War take place? We do not know. But if it, or something like it, was a historical event, it can be dated towards the end of the 2nd millennium BC. This marked the high point of a Bronze Age civilization that dominated Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. We call it Mycenaean after its main city Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese. It was its kings and warriors who sailed across the Aegean Sea and sacked Troy. Not many years after this victory, mysterious invaders put a violent end to the Mycenaean civilization. It is uncertain who they were, but they ushered in a poorly understood period that modern scholars have called a Dark Age. Centuries of economic and social collapse followed. This meant that Homer was evoking a way of life only dimly remembered. The Iliad and the Odyssey are fictions, but in one crucial sense they embody an essential historical truth, in that they showed many generations of Greeks who they were and what values to live by. Homer exercised an almost biblical authority. Here, in brief, is the story that he tells. The siege of Troy lasted for a decade, but the events in the Iliad cover only a period of 54 days in the 9th year, and most of the action takes place within 4 full days. But this close shot captures the glory and the tragedy of slaughter that seems to have no end. Warfare in Homer is, in essence, a succession of duels between princes and kings. They ride in chariots and throw spears at their opponents. The common people mill about in the background. Achilles, a handsome, lordly, and invincible fighter, occupies the heart of the story. He is by far the best soldier among the Greeks, but he has a terrible temper. He falls out with his commander-in-chief, King Agamemnon of Mycenae, over 2 pretty girls. The first is Chryseis, the daughter of a local priest dedicated to the archer god Apollo, in appearance a handsome youth eternally in his late teens. Captured by the Greeks on a raid, she is donated as human booty to Agamemnon. Her father complains to the god and pleads for redress. Then a plague strikes the expeditionary force. The soldiers are crowded into huts on a beach not far from the city of Troy, a few miles inland. Their ships are drawn up on the sand beside them. Many die. A soothsayer announces that the epidemic is the gods' punishment for Chryseis' capture and advises that she be returned to her father at once. The Hellenic universe was very different from our own. Homer's men and women lived simultaneously in what could be called parallel universes. In one of them, things are as they seem. A plague is a plague. But in the second, the gods are in charge. On this occasion, Apollo comes down in fury on the camp. His arrows clanged in their quiver. His descent was like nightfall, says the poet. He sat down opposite the ships and shot an arrow with a dreadful twang from his silver bow. He attacked the mules and the nimble dogs. Then he aimed sharp arrows at the men and struck again and again. Day and night innumerable fires consumed the dead. So through one door of perception an event has a rational explanation, through another supernatural. The Greeks believed that both are true at one and the same time. The chief deities in the Hellenic pantheon are a squabbling family of anthropomorphic immortals. They live in a palace on the peak of Mount Olympus in northern Greece. They enjoy tricks and practical jokes, and their unquenchable laughter echoes around the mountain-tops. Their loves and hates make an entertaining soap opera, but, as we have heard, they are not funny at all when they turn their attention to human beings. Head of the family is Zeus, the thunderer and cloud-compeller, and a henpecked husband. His wife, Hera, is always plotting to obstruct his plans. Then there is the warrior Athena, protectress of Athens. She is the goddess of wisdom and patron of the arts and crafts. She calls her father an obstinate old sinner, always interfering with my plans. Both goddesses loathe the Trojans and work tirelessly for their downfall. This is because they and the goddess of love, Aphrodite, competed long ago for a golden apple, which was to be awarded to the most beautiful of the three. A young Trojan prince, Paris, was the judge, and he gave the prize to Aphrodite. If he chose her, she promised him the most beautiful woman in the world for his paramour. Her name is Helen, and inconveniently she is already spoken for. She is the wife of King Menelaus of Sparta in southern Greece. Paris pays her a visit, and they elope to Troy. It is this offence that sets off the war. These gods are not models of virtue and do not expect invariable virtue from their worshippers. Rather, each of them stands for emotions or principles or skills that reflect and magnify those of human beings. The Greeks were deeply religious, not so much to learn the rules of morality as to keep on the good side of the gods and to find out what their intentions were. They achieved this by sacrificing animals in their honor and reading their entrails, and by consulting soothsayers, prophecy books, and oracles before any important decision was taken. They held festivals and conducted ceremonies in their honor. They peppered the countryside with temples, shrines, groves, and sacred caves in honor of one deity or another. They did not trouble themselves over theological dogma. Religion was about ritual rather than belief. Agamemnon calls a general assembly of the army and his fellow kings and princes. He agrees to return Chryseis to her father, and Apollo stops shooting. The plague ends. The king then makes a bad mistake. To make up his loss, he confiscates Briseis, another attractive female captive who has been allocated to Achilles. Enraged, the warrior withdraws from the war and sulks in his hut. He broods over his fate. At his birth, destiny gave him the alternatives of a short but glorious life on the field of battle or a long but undistinguished one at home. It is no choice. Since his birth, his mother, a sea goddess called Thetis, has tried every trick to save him from an early death. When he was a boy, she dressed him in girls' clothes and had him brought up among girls. But the unexpected pregnancy of a fellow pupil revealed his true gender. Like most Greeks, the adult Achilles recognizes the brevity of life and, while he believes that death is not the end, has few hopes of happiness in the underworld where the spirits of human beings pass a dim and futile eternity. On his long return journey home after the war is over, the crafty Odysseus is given the rare privilege of visiting the underworld while still alive. He encounters the ghost of Achilles, who is as angry as he used to be in the light of the sun. He complains about the afterlife. "Put me on earth again, and I would rather be a serf in the house of some landless man with little enough for himself to live on than king of all these dead men that have done with life. But enough." A few years earlier, as the still-living Achilles sits idly on the beach in front of Troy, he is aware of what lies in store for him. He is supremely competitive, a characteristic he shares with future generations of Greeks who will be as contentious as he is. Homer expresses the general attitude concisely when he puts these words in the mouth of a warrior. "Let your motto be, 'I lead. Strive to be best.'" However, for the time being, Achilles is letting his aggression rust. The Trojans, led by Prince Hector, the king of Troy's eldest son and their match for Achilles, begin to gain the upper hand in battles on the plain that lies between the city and the sea. The Greeks, or Achaeans as they were called in the poem, build a great defensive wall to protect their ships and the encampment on the beach. Homer describes the fighting in great gory detail. He achieves two simultaneous and contradictory effects. War is glorious and, at the same time, a great evil. A ferocious Greek warrior called Aias runs amok. Homer, who has a wonderful talent for comparing the high deeds of kings and princes to the low experiences of ordinary life, compares Aias to a donkey who gets the better of the boys in charge of him. He turns into a field they are passing and helps himself to the standing crop. He adds that the animal pays no attention to the sticks that are broken on his back until he has eaten his fill. In another telling image, the goddess Athena implants in the breast of King Menelaus the daring of a fly, which is so fond of human blood that it returns to the attack however often a man may brush it from his face. But for every winner in war there is a loser. The poet gives each of the unnumbered fallen a touching epitaph. To select one killing from many, an archer fires an arrow into the chest of a young Trojan. In a moving, pitch-perfect simile, Homer writes, "Weighed down by his helmet, Gorgythian's head dropped to one side, like the lolling head of a garden poppy, weighed down by its seed in the showers of spring." Zeus sits on a nearby mountain-top, thundering balefully and sending down flashes of lightning as he surveys the scene. He never shifts his bright eyes from the fighting. Things are looking so bad for the Greeks that Patroclus, who is Achilles' best friend and, according to some, older lover, begs him to let him join the fighting and save the day. Achilles reluctantly agrees and lends Patroclus his famous armor. There is something almost psychopathic in the nature of Achilles. Talking with his friend, he imagines them alone, alive and triumphant over all the world. "How happy I should be if not a single Trojan got away alive, not one, and not a Greek either. And if we too survived the massacre, how happy I would be to pull down Troy's holy diadem of towers single-handed." When Patroclus enters the battle, everyone mistakes him for Achilles because of the armor he is wearing. He dispatches many of the enemy, but he does not know when to stop. He comes up against Hector, a better fighter, who kills him and strips him of Achilles' armor. After a fierce struggle, the Greeks rescue his corpse. Achilles is devastated. Heroes in Homer express their feelings, and he cannot stop crying. One night he dreams of Patroclus and holds out his arms to embrace him. In vain. The vision vanished like a wisp of smoke and went gibbering underground. Achilles leapt up in amazement. He beat his hands together and in his desolation cried, "Ah, then, it is true that something of us does survive, but with no intellect at all, only the ghost and semblance of a man." Determined on revenge, Achilles makes up his quarrel with Agamemnon and goes out once more to fight the Trojans. He chases after Hector, who loses his nerve and runs away. Eventually the breathless Trojan halts and faces his unforgiving foe. The gods watch in silence. Zeus confesses to a fondness for Hector and asks the others to agree to spare his life. "What are you saying?" Athena bursts out, adding that his doom...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?